Okay, I'm going to just go ahead and get started, I think. So I want to welcome everybody to our session, a second look at sectoral bargaining. What can we learn from new and old models of organizing, modernizing institutions, and managing technological change? So I'm Heather Grob. I'm professor and chair of the Business and Economics Department at St. Martin's University here in Washington State. It's weather is kind of similar to Portland right now, cloudy and rainy. So, and I just want to thank our chair and all of our speakers for joining us today. And also Matt Boda, Lou McMurran are going to be helping me with moderating and timekeeping. So thank you. Our session will be recorded, but if you want to say something off the record, please identify it as such. Our speakers are as follows. If I can get there we go. We're going to have about 6 minutes allocated to each with time for at least one question for each speaker, hopefully. If everybody will make sure that you're muted, and then don't forget to unmute yourselves when you're speaking. We'll keep things muted until all the presenters are done. We'll just take questions from the chat function, so make sure you use that chat function. And we want to make sure that we have some time at the end, so our presenters are going to try to keep things a little on the brief side. So please make sure that you stay muted and use the chat function until all our speakers are finished. And you're welcome to contact the panelists afterwards. Maybe if you join for the happy hours later, we can continue the discussion. So just a few comments from our chair, David Weil, who probably needs no introduction to most of us, but who became the dean and professor of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University in August of 2017. And prior to that was Wexler Professor of Management at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. He was appointed by President Barack Obama to be the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor from 2014 to 17. And he's a longtime LIRA member, friend, and fellow Colorado native. All right, David, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to introduce the session for us.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And I will keep this brief. At the last annual LIRA meetings and in many different forums, a lot of us have been involved in, we've debated the question of the future of work and how the workplace has been reshaped by business restructuring, technology, digital platforms, and declining worker power. One of the responses to those changes that has become discussed more and more has been a call to move away from enterprise level forms of organizing and representation and towards broader kinds of sectoral bargaining models. The challenge is, though a lot of people talk about sectoral bargaining, it actually means many different things. And plays out in multiple forms. If you look at the international experience with sectoral bargaining, or the experiences that we have had at various times and in different kinds of constructs in the United States. So the purpose of this panel is to dive into the sectoral bargaining question, but not through speculation of what might be, but much more by reviewing what we know from current experience and approaches to organizing, representation, benefits provision, and understanding both worker and employer perspectives as they might pertain to sectoral bargaining. And we want to answer the question and have a discussion about what do those experiences tell us about the prospects for sectoral bargaining based on what we actually know about it today. And we have four presentations that are going to allow us to explore this question. So let me very briefly introduce our speakers and then we'll get right into it. Ken Jacobs is the chair of the UC Berkeley Labor Center, where he's been a labor specialist since 2002. Ken's areas of specialization include low-wage work, labor standards policies, and healthcare coverage. Lou McMurran is at the Washington State Workforce Education and Training Board, which is a state agency committed to sustaining Washington's economic vitality through skilled workforce development. And Lou has extensive experience with policy development, policy implementation, as well as being involved in a range of entrepreneurial ventures. Heather Grob, who you have already met, is Associate Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Business and Economics Department at St. Martin's University. Heather has been a very involved member of the research community for over 20 years, teaching labor economics, as well as studying multi-employer labor management systems. And finally, Lisa Jordan is the Director of Education and Membership Development at the United Steelworkers of America. And Lisa has been involved in particular in USWA efforts to organize gig workers, which she'll speak about. Heather mentioned Matt Boda is also with us as a moderator, and he's a Vice Provost for Academic Personnel and Budget at the University of Rhode Island, and a LIRA member, of course. I will just reiterate what Heather said, and that is a plea for our presenters to keep their comments to 6 minutes. I will field one of the questions from the chat for each of our presenters right after they speak, and then that will hopefully leave ample time for other questions from the audience. So with that, let me turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, David. I'm going to talk about some joint work with Rebecca Smith and Justin McBride on state and local policies and sectoral bargaining. As David discussed, enterprise level collective bargaining, as we've seen in the United States, is poorly suited to the current organization of firms in an important part of the US economy, where the employment relationship for large numbers of low-wage workers is separated from the firm with economic power in the supply chain, which weakens workers' bargaining power and creates obstacles to unionization, which has created increased interest in sectoral bargaining as a way to level the playing field across industry sectors. And we're particularly focused on the potential for state and local models to raise labor standards and build an infrastructure for worker organizing while providing some proof of concept for national reforms. And so I'm going to talk about some of the different models out there for sectoral wage setting and sectoral bargaining, a few of the local experiments, and some very early conclusions. So multi-employer agreements, of course, the main historical method for sectoral bargaining in the United States. These are private collective agreements, of course, within a public legal framework. Includes both master agreements and pattern bargaining. National agreements were generally eliminated by the late 1980s under pressure from declining union density and deregulation, but continue to exist and function on a local level in industries where union density is high. And voluntary sectoral bargaining systems have also eroded in countries like Germany under the pressure of European integration. The most common method of sectoral bargaining globally is through wage extenders, a hybrid public and private process for wage setting, where standards in the collective agreement negotiated between unions and employer organizations is extended across the industry. Usually requires a certain threshold of coverage for the agreement, and extensions may be automatic or more often require ratification by a government ministry. This stabilizes multi-employer bargaining by leveling the playing field between firms and incentivizing employer participation. And just note, this isn't alien in the United States. Prevailing wage has been used for more than a century to set common standards for public construction. And in some states like California, the prevailing wage is effectively the collective bargain rate. San Francisco has expanded this to quite a few different industries and occupations. But there are some legal limits, which we can discuss, on extension into the private sector under current law. The other method that's been used to set wage standards sectorally is just straight through legislation and sectoral minimum wages. This has been done very broadly in Australia, But in the United States, it's been used in airports by SEIU and Unite Here to set standards for ground-based airport workers. And Unite Here has also had success in passing hotel minimum wage policies, and we're now up to 6 cities in California with such policies. One of the methods that's generated a lot of interest recently, in part due to really important work by Kate Andreas, is labor standards boards, which really argues the American model of tripartite negotiations. The FLSA originally included provisions for sectoral wage setting through a tripartite process involving employers, unions, and government. This was eliminated in the late 1940s as part of the anti-union backlash by employers. But California, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut continue to have formal statutory provisions for wage boards or commissions, and that's how the fast food minimum wage was established in New York. These are publicly appointed boards with representation of labor employers and the public, which set standards in an industry. So like sectoral minimum wages, this is a legal standard, but like wage extenders, there's a direct role of worker organizations. The wage setting process can be a focal point for organizing. There's direct representation of workers on the board, and it creates this infrastructure for potential for self-sustaining worker organization. So a few examples here in Seattle, the recent creation of the Domestic Worker Standards Board, which covers workers whether they're employees or independent contractors, creates a bedrock of labor rights in an industry originally excluded from the protections of FLSA. The board's mandated to include considerations of wages, pay differentials, portable retirement and health benefits, outreach and enforcement strategies. This is not a direct decision-making body. They do make recommendations to the mayor and city council, which must be accepted or rejected. Other recent examples in the area of gig workers, we see in the transportation network companies. The New York Transportation and Limousine Commission was the first to establish, though not really a wage board or a standards board, was the first to establish standards for labor platform drivers. And in Seattle, they're now in a process of setting minimum pay standards for platform drivers, which will include a surcharge on rides to finance an independent driver resolution center run by a worker organization, which has the potential for being a focal point for driver organizing in Seattle. And another example we find in Alameda County, a recent passed childcare measure includes a childcare advisory council with worker representation that makes recommendations on expenditures and compensation for childcare workers and provides a mechanism for dues deduction if childcare workers designate a professional or labor organization as their representative and ensures public money is not spent on anti-union activity. So overall, there is some controversy within labor around sectoral bargaining and concern about a free rider problem. And I think, as David said at the beginning, we don't know what will work. And state and local policies provide a way to experiment and to learn. And this is an area where we need greater experimentation. One area we should be looking at is state or local industry councils could play an important role in the response to COVID-19 and setting conditions on workplaces around reopening and monitoring health and safety as they do. Note that this is not a substitute for worker organizing. Policies cannot be won without strong worker organizing, nor can they be successful. And it's not a substitute for strong federal standards, since many parts of the country don't allow local policies, but should more be seen as a building block for national reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken. I'd urge people to use the chat function if you have questions. Since no one has, I'm going to take my position as chair to ask Ken a question, and that is, you've talked about a bunch of different sectoral bargaining structures, or what you're calling sectoral bargaining. My question is, when do we know it is or isn't sectoral bargaining? I mean, one could say in your list, it's simply the absence of enterprise level bargaining that delineates it, or how are you thinking about what sets the boundaries of when we have this and what that helps us in terms of understanding future proposals for doing so?
I think of it as ways to set standards across the supply chain so that that division between where power is in the supply chain and who the employer is doesn't matter. And so in high union density areas and regions, that can be done and has been done on a voluntary basis. It can also be done through various policy mechanisms. But the key thing is that both there's a bargaining role, which means there is a role for workers in the wage setting process, and a way to build work organization through that, and the policy applies, or the rules apply across the relevant part of that supply chain.
Thank you. We'll come back to that question and other questions that might be coming up during the discussion, but let me turn next to Lou.
Thanks, Dave and panelists. Good morning. I am Louis McMurran, co-manager, Future of Work Task Force for the Washington Workforce Board. I had the opportunity of co-leading the nation's first legislatively created Future of Work Task Force, comprised of 6 members each from labor and business, and 4 legislators, 1 from each legislative caucus. And I want to welcome Stan Sorcher, one of our labor members of our Future of Work Task Force. And Ken, we worked with Annetta Bernhardt from UC Berkeley, and you probably know Rebecca Smith from NELP as well too, who were outstanding members of our task force. The initial, and also too, I've posted a link to the final report as well as our enabling legislation in the chat if you have any interest in pulling those up. The initial concerns the legislation covered were the effects of automation on manufacturing jobs, how that impacts blue-collar workers and the communities they reside in, particularly smaller towns and rural areas. The task force was created to, quote, assess trends and factors driving transformation of industries, identify policies and practices that will help Washington's businesses, workers, and communities thrive economically, recommend mechanisms and structures for sustainable industry sector partnerships, and create a policy framework that supports a talent development pipeline and lifelong learning structure. In other words, boil the ocean. The enabling legislation also set forth some to-dos, such as performing research, stakeholder engagement, consultation with other agencies, trade groups, worker organizations, and groups representing populations with barriers to economic participation. A little bit about the state agency under which this project fell. In Washington State, the Workforce Training Education Coordinating Board, or Workforce Board, is designed to equally represent business and labor with non-voting representation from several other state agencies. As such, our agency is where business and labor come together on shared interests around workforce development, as opposed to other venues where business and labor are not always on the same page, like the legislature or our Labor and Industries Department that enforces OSHA laws or other regulations. The Workforce Board is also a kitchen sink full of other workforce system related duties like WIO administration, private career school regulation, adult education evaluation, and more. We're technically a small cabinet agency, so this task force was a bit of a coup for our agency. Within the task force, the labor delegation came more from the ranks of advocates and lobbyists, actually several of whom I knew from my time as a lobbyist in Washington State, while the business delegation comprised of 3 HR directors who were living the future of work, an employment attorney for a large tech company, and a former insurance company project manager. The one business advocate lobbyist type of the task force never really showed up to any of the meetings, or maybe once by phone. This particular mix and dynamics provided the labor group actually more opportunities to vocalize their priority issues with not as much, not a lot of pushback for the business side. The labor folks were really on message during the meetings. The business folks didn't agree with everything, but the discussions were really open and robust, and a lot of common ground was shared and created. Of course, in any situation where you have people of differing backgrounds and perspectives put together through a legislative and political process, the dynamics can get tricky, and there's a risk that you could break into camps and take hardline positions. Fortunately, that didn't occur, and that's really a credit to the task force members themselves. Plus, I think the fact that I had a chance to work with a number of these folks in the past, and we had a lot of side conversations that ensured that issues didn't get too heated and that everyone was heard. The employers also were generally pretty enlightened in terms of how they treated their own employees, wage and benefit levels, retirement plans, opportunities for advancement, and that sort of thing. Due to this interplay, the task force's final report, I believe, has a slightly more labor flavor, if you will, shown by a whole section on job quality, which was really one of the key messages of labor in this task force, was how job quality had been reduced and how important it was to prevent that from occurring and improve job quality. The topics of advanced technology, of course, came up, especially around AI, automation, robots, potential impacts on jobs, the need for training and upskilling, efficacy of the public workforce development system, and a whole bunch of other issues. Fantastic information was brought out, and frankly, Annetta Bernhardt did a fantastic job about how automation can affect jobs and de-skill and that kind of thing. This was confirmed by a lot of our research as well too by my colleague and myself. Labor really pushed for a worker voice. And we heard a lot of angst about how technology is currently used in the workplace, especially around monitoring and surveillance, and how that dehumanizes and can de-skill jobs. In this realm, the conversations moved all over the place to find some common ground. But again, a great deal of credit goes to the task force members themselves on both sides to put aside some philosophical considerations for practical ways to develop policy recommendations that were agreed to. The one area where I think the business delegation was surprisingly open was this notion of a worker voice in planning how to adopt advanced technology. Most of these businesses understood that including workers who were going to be impacted by new technology and processes that could potentially be displaced was a much better way to gain acceptance, as we've seen in some European countries. While the business delegation represented a limited number of industries, the notion that the worker voice should be included was very well accepted. They both also agreed that there could and should be much more involvement of business and labor in designing and evaluating training programs using public dollars. What was a bit disappointing, at least for my colleague and myself, was that both delegations kind of shied away from how state government is using or planning to use advanced technology and the workforce implications of that. We did settle in on one recommendation around this topic in particular, but I believe there's a lot more to be done around the future of the government workforce and the government use of advanced technology. If there's one thing that we've seen from this pandemic is that the future of work has been thrown right into our laps. We cannot avoid dealing with this as we concurrently deal with racial justice issues as they go hand in hand in many respects. Just as society has to come to grips with how we've hurt African Americans, we also have to come to grips with forging a new bargain between workers and employers, one that which benefits all, not just a few on either side. I'll end with that. I'm happy to entertain any questions, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Louis. Again, I don't see any questions specifically for Louis from the chat, so I'm going to take, let me ask you the following question about, there's sometimes a delineation in labor management settings made between issues that are integrative, where there's sort of joint interest, win-win situations, versus distributive issues where one side is going to have to give something up to benefit the other side. Can you talk a little bit, you hinted at it with the adoption of technology versus other aspects of technology issue. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic between how your labor management discussions in this sectoral setting played out, delineating those kinds of things that are more integrative, more win-win, versus the ones where there are tougher trade-offs and distributions to deal with?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And also too, Stan, I would really welcome your comments too at some point. So Stan Sorcher's on here, and I'd welcome his perspective as well. Also too, he was a former SPIA employee, and so he's been involved in sectoral bargaining. This is not a topic of my of expertise, but to try to answer your question, David, you know, really this was about developing policy recommendations, right? So, you know, in our state too, I mean, really, labor kind of has the upper hand politically. So, I mean, overall, you weren't going to see anything that was going to come out of this that was going to really favor any one side or the other. So really, it came down to, can we take ourselves above the fray, if you will, and come together around where can we develop some shared policy that we can agree that the legislature could adopt that showed that business and labor could come together. So again, so really, the whole vibe was, let's come together in a shared experience. And again, because our workforce board cooperates, right? Its natural state is a cooperative state, right? Compared to other bodies like our apprenticeship council, for example, right? I mean, if you come in with a new apprenticeship program, yeah, that's going to be pretty darn contentious about getting that through, right? You get a lot more of this, of these, I guess, distributive issues than you would. So because I think the overlay was policy development as opposed to really like we're going to change anything in the way that unions and management bargain or business bargain, you know, that allowed for, I think, good discussion to occur free from really kind of the strictures that, you know, that again, a political or legislative process might put upon you. Again, I don't know if that's helpful or answers your question, but that's kind of how it went. Again, too, I would, you know, I'll unmute Stan here, or if he can unmute himself, if he wants to just make a quick comment on that. So.
Yeah, I'd agree with Lou. If there was, this is basically interest-based bargaining, especially since we had HR reps. I wouldn't, I'm surprised to hear that labor has the upper hand. That's, we're dealing with Microsoft and Boeing and Amazon in the state. But if there was tension, it was probably more among the legislators than the labor and management folks. But mostly it was problem solving and fairly cooperative.
Thank you, Lou and Stan. And we can come back to some of those issues in the discussion. So let me turn now to Heather.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion already. I am just going to try to pull up my presentation here. Can you guys see it? Good, okay. So, let's see. Oh, no, wrong one. Sorry, I'm wasting my time. All right, stop share. Let me try this one more time. Let's see. Okay, there we go. All right, that should work from beginning. There we go. Okay, so hi everybody, Heather Grob here from St. Martin's University, and I'm glad this is so well attended today because in the past I've sometimes bemoaned the fact that I would oftentimes say, well, multi-employer systems might be a good model for us to look at when we're looking at problems of people who might find themselves in more contingent work situations. And usually at LIRA conferences, it would just be a few of us doing that. So I'm also a little shout out to Janice Fine for suggesting that we kind of rename it so that we can broaden the discussion beyond just construction to a second look for sectoral bargaining. So just to begin, we do know that there are a lot of contingent workers who don't have access to either private or public benefits, but potentially there is a system for handling this. And multi-employer benefit systems can provide some greater portability, but they're also a little difficult to manage and there's some flaws with them. Yet they're, I think, still provide some promise for a variety of reasons I hope we can discuss. And the question is really, are these applicable to other sectors? And if so, how? For that, I think we need a lot more experimentation and we need more research to be done on it. There's basically, when we look at the, there's a difference here between multi-employer, which is, for the sake of clarity, I'll just say is the labor side, the union management, collective bargaining agreements, and multiple employer. And today I'll be talking about retirement and health, training and hiring halls, and dispute resolution, all hopefully within the span of 6 minutes. So moving on to retirement, basically we have here with multi-employer Taft-Hartley funds, those are mostly defined benefits still. Some of them are moving over to more hybrid defined benefit, defined contribution funds. And some of these funds were just kind of pulling out of their insolvency when 2020 happened, as I like to say. So these, they're probably further endangered right now. But they are still a really important source of funding for about 11 million participants in over 1,200 plans. But it is mostly construction, but it's also the arts, service industry, and so on. Multiple employer plans, and that's not necessarily collectively bargained, those have been on the rise, and they're not union, but they're often sectoral in nature. They have to be retirement funds that have some sort of common business. They do allow employers with business in common to contribute on behalf of employees, but the transparency and reporting requirements are pretty poor, actually. And of course, there are IRAs and the idea of guaranteed retirement accounts that Teresa Gallarducci has proposed. And while providing a lot more really great portability, individual accounts may actually reduce employers' perceived responsibility to the workforce and narrow the advantage that the multi-employer relationship may have. Just to show you here, that top line is the decline in defined benefit plans, and the bottom line here is increase in defined contribution plans over time from 1975 to 2016. So moving on to health and welfare funds, these are also like Taft-Hartley pension plans. They're collectively bargained and managed jointly. They're often contracted with a third-party administrator. And these, basically the union's in the position of acting like an employer or leasing company with all of the kinds of employment laws and legalities that go along with that. So there could be discrimination charges, employers' right to refusal is really controversial. But they can, in doing the hiring hall, also insist on certain conditions of work among employers. Part of the problem here too, though, is that hiring policies vary a lot from local to local. Essentially, there is a power here that unions can have in operating a hiring hall, which is that they can ration the work and they can do some of that sort of on behalf of employers. And it can be non-exclusive. So in other words, they can charge a fee to non-union employers, even in right to work states. So I'll just mention also, a lot of these are seen as Cadillac plans. And so they have some of the same problems that other healthcare plans had when the Affordable Care Act went into place. There are a lot of challenges to these right now. And then also they have to follow COBRA extensions for coronavirus and other kinds of decisions that are made by Congress. Apprenticeship and training programs, I see you, Lou, thank you. Apprenticeship and training programs are also mainly supported by the, I'll just say for this slide, they're mainly supported through collective bargaining. The vast majority of these are in construction. They tend to be longer, more comprehensive kinds of programs, and they're also financed through cents per hour contributions. But there are some others developing in states dealing with like computer programming, auto repair, some more traditional manufacturing as well. And those seem to be a little bit on the rise. I'll say, whoops, let's see. Dispute resolution, that's a really vital part of all of this. And the main point I'll make here is that all of these things really hang together. So they're threatened right now, but there are also, there are a lot of good things about this as well. I think I realize this is a little controversial, but it is a really vital part of this. Matt Boda and I have just written a little history on the Council on Industrial Relations, which is a great model of dispute resolution. They actually have to make decisions unanimously. But in my paper, I go into a little more of some of the issues there as well. But one of the things that makes it work really well is that there's peer review, right, on both the labor and the management side. So there's a lot of pressure to come up with a solution quickly and pretty cost effectively. To conclude here, I think there are a lot of things to think about in terms of how applicable these kinds of systems might be. You know, one positive is that they're still legal, but I think there are a lot of questions about globalization and industry competitiveness, different supply chains, and so on. It may be that to have these things actually be renewed, that we'd have to have some kind of industrial policy that works with the labor management kinds of goals and objectives. And also, I'm thinking that probably some of these are a little better suited to sectors that are largely domestic with small employers, because basically they're able to obtain economies of scale and economies of scope. But they require a lot of oversight and funding as well. But I think, you know, government and community groups could learn how to support them, and maybe not just see this as like the domain of construction and mostly white men. There's certainly a lot of other people who benefit from these kinds of structures. So if anybody's interested in doing some more research with me on this, I would love to try to get a collected volume together. I've been talking with Valeria Pulignano and Nick Hammer about doing something international as well. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So let me ask you a question, linking again to the theme of this panel, and that is the discussion prospectively of sectoral bargaining is at times a little amorphous about what we mean. Mm-hmm. And I think the construction sector, which is the basis of your observation, really gives us potentially something to think about in terms of the boundaries of where the kind of multi-employer systems covering the range of issues you described start and stop. And so some sectoral multi-employer structures in construction are very localized. Some are regional. There are some national agreements that are multi-employer. So what do we learn? What do we know from the boundaries of multi-employer structures in the construction industry that could be fruitful for our understanding of this more general question about what sectoral bargaining might look for other sectors?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure I have a clearly defined answer to that, but I have been thinking about it. And it was interesting. I've actually spent a lot of the last month or so, or couple of months, looking at spending my time in 1919, looking at the development of some of these labor management relationships in construction. And the concern then, I think, is really similar to the concerns that we have now, which is on the quality of contracting. And so what they were really trying to do was to and I have to say that, and I have in my papers, that it really was driven by employers' concerns about the labor problem at the time, but also about a lot of competitiveness then, where the quality of labor and the quality of contracting was suffering. So they were seeing things not outsourced in the sense of going overseas, but being brought into other kinds of sectors other than, for instance, electrical contracting. So it was kind of downscaling, and there was concern about where that's happening. Would employers have a common interest in trying to preserve their labor force? So I think, you know, it has been kind of the domain, if you will, of areas where people do need to have a fair amount of training and safety training, for example, and knowledge about the industry, versus maybe doing things we might consider a little, you know, requiring a little less human capital investment. So, you know, that doesn't really give us a clear idea there, but I think it's, you know, looking at those junctures where you have contracting out or contracting in, where there's a threat that the quality of labor may suffer. So how we define that, I don't know, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
Thank you, Heather. let's move on to our last presentation. Lisa.
Oh, unmute.
You're muted.
I turned on my timer for myself and forgot to unmute, but I'm going to talk about organizing the HCL workers, but I want to step back for a second because we're talking about sustainability and sectorial bargaining. So I want to address that for a minute. Like Heather, I'm a labor economist. And when I think about sectorial bargaining, I work for the United Steelworkers at this point. We do a ton of pattern bargaining, right? We have patterns in our oil sector. We have patterns across many sectors that we represent. We've been creating patterns recently in the paper sector, but I'm much more skeptical about broader sectorial bargaining. So I want to talk for a minute about that and about this whole idea that we're sort of writing off unions as they currently exist. So I'd like to begin by quoting George Barnett in his presidential address to the American Economic Association. He said, "American trade unionism is slowly being limited and influenced by changes which destroy the basis on which it was erected. It's probable that changes in the law have adversely affected unionism. Certainly, the growth of large corporations has done so. But over and above these influences, the relative decline of power of trade unionism is due to occupational changes and to technological revolution. The changes, occupational and technological, which check the advance of trade unionism in the last decade, appear likely to continue in the same direction. It is hazardous to prophesize, but I see no reason to believe that the American trade unionism will so revolutionize itself within a short period of time as to become in the next decade a more potent social influence than it has been in the past." Of course, that was 1932. In 1930, unionization rates were 12% in the United States. By 1941, they'd grown to 27%. So what happened? Industrial unionism is what happened, right? Gompers supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. Eugene Debs came in with his own brand of unionism that brought everybody in, and then the CIO emerges. My union was one of the CIO unions, right? Our first founding principle is to unite all regardless of race, sex, gender, or national orientation eligible for membership. So radical transformations can happen. The reason that I'm skeptical about sectorial bargaining is just the cases that we've talked about. When you talk about Seattle, you're talking about a place, as noted, very different than Birmingham, Alabama, where they tried to have an increased minimum wage that was fought back by the state. They weren't allowed to do that. When we talk about the Fight for 15 that's been successful, that couldn't have happened without SEIU's funding. But SEIU hasn't gotten enough members to offset the cost of those campaigns. My own union has underwritten the Association of College Football Players, which has been very successful politically and gotten legislation, but we have no members from that. So unless you have the institution of the trade union movement and the way that we've structured to have those funds, it's hard to fight these campaigns on a large scale. We even mentioned already today was the Fair Labor Standards Act, which included sectorial bargaining, but as political climates changed, everything changed. So the thing about a union contract is it's negotiated and we have power in that. Whereas in when you think about governments and local politics, that moves with whims and tides, right? So we're not as powerful as we once were, certainly. I mean, we're down to what, 7%? But we also have President Trump in office who's decimated the National Labor Relations Board. And so a lot of things are coming out from there now. If those rulings, if we didn't have our contracts in place, we would be in big trouble. So I think when I look at sectorial bargaining, and I know it's complicated, and we have multi-employer plans, as Heather knows, but the idea of relying on government as the regulator, unless we figure out a way to rethink unions and go back to like maybe a Knights of Labor model where everybody in the community pays into their union, where is the funding and the support and the fight going to come for the sectorial bargaining models like the Fight for 15, right? Like if the Steelworkers didn't have the funds, we couldn't have underwritten the football players for the past, 10 years till they made those political gains. So I want to transition very quickly because I only have a little time. Recently on The Simpsons, they had a whole episode about the new gig economy. Everybody's freaking out, what's going to happen? what I like to say is what's old is new again. So organizing HCL, we organized 80 workers. Why did they organize? Pay disparity. Why did they organize? They didn't have healthcare benefits. Why did they organize? Because some people got training and other people didn't get training, and it was all preferential. So that's why people organized. What does our bargaining look like? What does our committee look like? It's all virtual, right? You have people who are used to being organized online. You have people who are used to bargaining online. So that looks different, but what are they fighting for? Well, they found out that people doing exactly the same job, some were making $30,000 a year, some were making $52,000 a year. They wanted to change that. They wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to get the same educational opportunities. They wanted benefits and they wanted flexibility. They wanted to be able to work from home. That's when they started. Now they're all working from home. The company did what companies always do. They waged an anti-union campaign. They brought in big money lawyers. It is an international company, HCL, based in India. They have one unionized facility in Sweden. So everything looks exactly the same in this organizing campaign and our fight for a first contract as if we were organizing in any other sector. So it's my time's up, but I want to conclude by saying we're the United Steelworkers, but our three biggest locals are a hospital, a university, and a shipyard. So we're organizing every sector. And so our experience so far with organizing the Google workers is it's like organizing any other worker. If you got a boss, you need a union.
Thank you, Lisa. There are now a bunch of questions that have come up in the chat that maybe I can ask Lisa to do the first answer to it. Having been in 57,000 Zoom groups in the last week, I feel I'll try to field the questions, but Matt and Heather jump in if you see something I'm missing. Let me go back to William Herbert asked a question. What is the difference between traditional labor legislation lobbying to set labor standards and what is being referenced here broadly as sectoral bargaining? And maybe I could add to that what you started with, Lisa, and that is the kind of looking at the legacy of sectoral bargaining as it played out with the steelworkers. Could you start us and let other members of the panel also jump in on sort of describing what is the difference between using the legislation, using the kinds of things you just described in newer sectors versus collective bargaining and thinking about what is sectoral bargaining?
So I saw one other question pop up. I'm going to answer very quickly, which is what HCL does. They're almost all the marketing arm of Google. So they're doing the marketing stuff for Google. But to answer the question, I think that's where this question comes in about what is sectorial bargaining. And so if you think of the 5 for 15 as sectorial bargaining for food service workers, right? So if that's sectorial bargaining, then I think that's very similar to what labor legislation has tried to do as a whole. Like I would say Birmingham, the fight for increased minimum wage, I would include that in the sectorial bargaining category. So I don't really have a good answer to that question because I think they're very comparable things. But I think whether it's something we call sectorial bargaining or typical baseline labor legislation, that's the reason I'm skeptical about it, because I see so much get passed historically that then just can simply go away depending on who gets elected next time. So I don't know, somebody else on the panel might have a better call on that, because I think more about pattern bargaining than sectorial bargaining per se.
Other panelists want to jump in?
I'll just throw in a really quick comment to that. And I tend to think of this as more, at least in construction, these are more private agreements this is why dispute resolution is so important, because they uphold the conditions of the contract through those arrangements, and it's through the collective bargaining. Of course, you can't do that unless you have people who are unionized, right? And then of course the question is whether those contracts are upheld in the NLRB or even if people are covered under the NLRB. But the advantage for many of these kinds of multi-employer arrangements is that you're not kind of relying on the state to provide those benefits. You are actually going out and getting them on the private market. So, so I think that's it. If it can be done, it's very difficult to do it, and it's very difficult to manage it as well.
Thanks. Ken or Lou, any comments?
Just to say that, yeah, there's sectoral bargaining that's purely private, or private within a public construct, as discussed, and as we know, different people in power have a big effect on our National Labor Relations Board, and even union negotiations are not immune from changes in politics, and we've seen that pretty heavily, why in part we're looking at a 6% private sector union density rate in the United States. But I would say that, going back to a little bit what I said earlier, thinking of sectoral bargaining as being a place where there's a direct role of workers and employers in the negotiation process that is setting labor standards. And so that can be done purely privately, or that can be done, as we see is common in Europe, where there's a private agreement that then is extended by government into the rest of the industries, which has helped stabilize collective bargaining and increased union. And it's not totally related to union density, but the countries with greater union density have these kinds of systems where the agreements are extended sectorally. So, I think there is, and in arguing for that is not arguing against traditional union organizing. It is to say that in different industries, based on the structure of those industries, different strategies are needed in order to address the kinds of complications we have, which is why from the very beginning, the rules governing construction were different than the rules governing industrial unions. And there was also different rules created around garment, with the garment proviso for those very reasons, because we have fissuring in that industry. So I think it's important to think about this industry by industry and what are the rules that can work within that construct to uphold it, and to think of looking for some places where there is a greater role of government or greater rules as not being saying, well, then you shouldn't do what you're doing in your industries, but more that we need to experiment and try different approaches given how low we are. Some will work, some won't. And that's why I'm big on trying some of this stuff at the state and local level and figuring out what works. Thanks.
And let the record show the word fissuring was used and it didn't come from my mouth. So let me ask another question that's come from, and this actually went to Ken from the chat. Are there examples of labor unions or worker organizations using labor standards boards or legislation to launch or bolster establishment or firm level unionization, sort of working backwards from a sectoral level back to a more traditional form?
Absolutely, and I think in a private reply in that chat, I use the example of what's happened at airports, where SEIU and Unite Here have very successfully used creating airport labor standards policies to both as an organizing vehicle and organizing workers in those airports, but also making it possible to organize in those airports. Because if you organize an airline subcontractor, one subcontractor on their own, and you succeed in raising wages, they'll just lose the contract the next time around. So by creating these across the board labor standards policies, they created became an organizing tool, and they created conditions in which enterprise-based bargaining was possible. And I think that is the right way to think about how some of these kind of wage extender policies or other kinds of policies could work in both supporting new forms of organizing, but also for supporting traditional forms of organizing.
Thanks. Question came in for Lou from Jenna Myers. Can you say a little bit more why an apprenticeship program could be contentious?
Yeah, thanks, David. I answered Jenna in the chat, but I'll go ahead and talk about it. So in Washington, we just have really high standards for apprenticeships, right? So when you're putting in a new apprenticeship program, it's not easy to start with. And so, for example, the chair of our own workforce board, who works for McDonald Miller, they were looking to create a new apprenticeship for, I think it was like a control process technician. And they submitted it, and it came back with a whole, like, just a slew of, you know, things wrong with it, quote unquote. So first off, we just have high standards, and to get it right the first time is really difficult. Secondarily is that you're starting to see more apprenticeship programs in industries that are not traditionally union represented, like technology, healthcare to a certain extent, and a few others. And because, you know, organized labor has a you know, a pretty you know, strong voice on the apprenticeship council, you know, they tend to kind of, you know, push back a little bit on some of that stuff. There's a technology apprenticeship program called Apprenti, which is rolled out nationwide, that actually was formed by my old organization I used to work for. And I know that they've been very successful, but at the same time, they've had some contention with some labor groups about getting that in. So it's kind of political, but also too is the fact that we just have really high standards, and it's just not easy to get these things done right, because the 2,000 hours of classroom time and all the other things that go with building the proper kind of apprenticeship program. So, but there's a political angle to it too. I mean, I'm certainly, we're not, you know, that's not part of it.
Thanks. Let me ask this question to anyone on the panel, and this comes from Tom Cohen, connecting some of our discussions back to the realities of the pandemic, I think is the subtext of Tom's question. Tom asks, are there any state OSHA agencies using their authority to set standards for going back to work, scaling up, whatever you want to call it, in the current crisis, or any state governors that are bringing labor, industry, public health groups together to discuss what should health and safety standards look like? And again, what does that have to teach us about the issue of sectoral bargaining? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure, I'll start, Dave. Yeah, Washington our labor and industries is doing that kind of thing, where they are promulgating some rules around safety and health protocols and that kind of thing. Also, too, I know a lot of industry groups are really getting on top of it, like the Building Owners and Managers Association, the Retail Association, and others are working really closely with the governor's office and with agencies on setting up those protocols and safety and reopening type of situations. So yeah, they are definitely using the authority, not always to everyone's, you know, satisfaction, but it is being done.
Others, Ken, anything? And I know there's a lot of standard setting processes. Cal OSHA has been leading. Anything on this there?
I would say we've been doing a lot of work on this subject, particularly with some of our bigger employers. And very early on, we negotiated some agreements about what it was look like, and it's been kind of a rolling negotiations, to be honest. We did have a couple of contracts that had pandemic provisions that said that if there was a pandemic, employers would be paid their full salary for the duration. Who thought to negotiate that? I have no clue, but it was there. So I would say that at least in our union with our bigger sectors, again, it's sectorial stuff, we've been working across the paper sector with a number of our councils to get shared agreements for paper facilities. It's been complicated because even among our members, you know, if you wear a mask, you're a Democrat. If you don't, you're a Republican. So that's been a real challenge on the shop floor.
Thanks, Lisa. Ken, you're unmuted. Are you going to weigh in? Or?
Oh, no, just to say, I mean, I think there's a lot of good discussion going on in California around this right now. And I think one really good example that fits in this context is the UFCW in Los Angeles negotiated some conditions around health and safety around the pandemic for grocery workers, which at least one of which was then later put into law as one of the executive orders by the governor. So in terms of looking at, you know, private negotiated agreement, which then becomes the rule for the sector, we have seen some of that start, and I think there's an area that a lot more could be done right now.
Thanks. So there are, yeah, Lisa, go on.
I was just going to go back to the legislative stuff about trying to fight for legislation that then becomes the right of people to organize. I think that's a lot of what we've been doing around the college athlete stuff. We've been working really hard to try to get legislation passed that would allow athletes to organize and we've done a lot of stuff judicially around that. And so that was our big push of support with the college athletes to try to help them in that process. So that was my answer to that question.
Thank you. We are almost at the 2 o'clock hour, and I don't believe in uncompensated work, so I want to wrap this on time. I'd urge you take a look at some of the back and forth that's in the chat. Our panelists have answered other questions, and other people have answered questions. There's a lot of interesting back and forth and some links there. So I will make just one closing comment, riffing on something our LIRA president has asked, and that was, there was talk about sectoral bargaining in the Democratic, Adrian Eaton asked, talk about sectoral bargaining in the Democratic primaries. Adrian's question about is the Biden campaign said anything so far explicitly about this? I won't answer that question, but I would come back to an observation that I think the phrase sectoral bargaining is out there. I think it's sometimes a thought out kind of concept. I think other times right now, it feels a little bit like a phrase that's a bit empty of what is it actually about. I think this discussion has been terrific in giving us a sense that there is a lot to learn from the different ways it's been playing out in different contexts through different mechanisms, sometimes through unions, sometimes outside of collective bargaining structures. And I would simply say to all of us as a research community, as well as a community of practitioners, now is the time to really dig in to understand what this actually means, and to also be very clear about what we expect it to do. Do we expect sectoral bargaining outcomes to ripple out to other sectors? What does it mean to be a sector? How do we think it's going to affect all of the different outcomes that we care a lot about for workers, beginning with wages? And which sectoral structures seem to do that work better or worse? I think the more we can define what we think these new kinds of forms, or going back to Lisa's comment, pre-existing forms that have been out there teach us about where we're going, I think that will certainly improve if we ever move forward on this kind of idea in the future. So with that, let me thank our panelists for wonderful presentations, the audience for some great questions, and with hopes for this discussion to continue in future forums. Thank you.
Thank you all.